Good evening to everyone. Thank you very much for the welcome that you have given me here. The book that I've written began its life as a response to the revelations of sexual abuse in the church. For the 9 years, from 1994 to 2003, I was first a member and then for 6 years chairman of a committee established by the Australian bishops to coordinate a national response to these revelations so that as far as possible we might all act together, we might all act as one. In doing that, I spoke with literally hundreds of victims, individually and in groups. I met with offenders, I dealt with bishops and religious leaders, and for 9 years it completely dominated my life. There were many failures, but I also like to think there were some successes. It was an experience that changed me in so many ways that even if I wanted to, I could not now go back to being the person I was before. And out of this came the conviction that if ever we are to face the future with a clear conscience, there must, first of all, be profound change within the church. Firstly, there must be a study of the more immediate causes of abuse. And there I have suggested that we need to study very carefully 3 elements. Unhealthy psychology within individuals, whatever form it may take, and wherever it comes from. Unhealthy ideas concerning the 2 subjects of power and sex, and unhealthy living conditions. And I suggest that it's when these 3 things come together that we are most likely to find that murky world out of which abuse arises. And I believe that in a particular way, we need to look at any and all institutional factors that may have contributed to any one of these 3 things: unhealthy psychology, unhealthy ideas, unhealthy living conditions. By institutional, I mean the forces that one is subject to simply by belonging to a certain group or institution. Secondly, in addition to looking at abuse, we also need to look at the response to abuse, because as everyone here knows, this created at least as much scandal as the abuse itself. And here I believe that we must look at institutional factors that have led to individuals acting in a way that they certainly didn't start out with when they were first ordained to the priesthood, and yet institutional pressures seem to have caused them to act in very different ways, and I want to look at that a little this evening. Thirdly, it's my belief that these 2 areas, the immediate causes and the response, will inevitably lead to a study of all aspects of the 2 subjects of power and sex. In particular, sexual abuse is about power and sex, so it's obvious that we need to look at those 2 subjects. And this, I believe, is the fundamental difference between myself and those authorities who have criticized my book. I suggest that they are starting from the teachings of the church, and they're saying, here are these teachings proclaimed by the Pope. You may not question these teachings, not even in responding to sexual abuse. I'm starting from the opposite end. I'm starting from the fact of abuse. I'm saying, let's get to the very bottom of this, see any and all factors that may have contributed, and let's follow the argument wherever it may lead. And if it causes us to ask questions about church teachings, church laws, church practices, church attitudes, then let's ask those questions. That, I believe, is the fundamental difference. It's the point from which you start. I believe that unless we follow the argument wherever it leads, we are trying to respond to abuse while handcuffed and blindfolded. So briefly, the two subjects of power and sex. Firstly, power. Well, the issue is complex. I cannot hope to cover it this evening, and I cannot even hope to cover all the things that I speak of in the book. So I'll mention just two factors among many. The first can be summed up in a misunderstanding of a letter, of a sentence in the letter to the Hebrews. And this was a phrase that was quoted again and again and again during my seminary days. It says, "Every high priest chosen from among human beings is put in charge of things pertaining to God on their behalf." Now, the Greek text from which that's a translation says simply that you have 100 people here, one of them is taken and is given this job of the things pertaining to God on their behalf. Another one might be taken to look after the physical health of the group. Another might be taken to be a teacher. But one is taken for this task. However, the Latin translation of that Greek text made by St. Jerome and lasting right up until a few years ago didn't say taken, it used the Latin word assumptus, which means taken up. And that was the phrase that was quoted again and again in the seminary. Now it meant you had 100 people here, you took one of them, and you took him up above the others. And that's a very different concept. It led to a mystique of the priesthood, and to a lesser but real extent of religious life as well, but as somehow taken up on a pedestal above the others, and even at its extreme, not subject to the same laws, even moral laws, as other people were, up above them. And this, I suggest, is one of those really unhealthy ideas that I've said, unhealthy psychology, unhealthy ideas, unhealthy living conditions. This is one of those unhealthy ideas. It can contribute to sexual abuse. It can make a priest think he's above the laws that bind other people. And it can affect across many other fields as well, not just in relation to sexual abuse, this idea of superiority. Indeed, one or two of you may actually have met a priest who thought he was superior to you. Now, it's never easy to change an ethos or a mystique, but this ethos must change, for it denies the essential humanity of the priest or religious, and so it establishes a whole series of false relationships at the very heart of the community. Priests and religious are ordinary human beings. Now, that ought to be the most obvious of statements. And yet, both priests and religious on the one hand, and I'll suggest Catholic people on the other hand, need to do some rethinking on this subject. I've found that wherever there are priests and religious trying their level best to climb down from the pedestal, you can get both religious superiors and Catholic people telling them to get right back up there again. Always remember, when I was ordained a bishop, I had a game of golf with this very upright Catholic gentleman shortly afterwards. And the problem started on the very first tee. I hit off, "Good shot, my lord." On the first green, I missed a putt. Bad luck, my lord. And I said, but we're playing golf. My name's Jeff, couldn't we? Yes, my lord. You know, get back up on your pedestal. Now, this, it can be very real. Catholic people can want the priest to be different, somehow superior. It is a danger, and it requires the whole community to work at this one. The priest must be able to appear constantly as a fallible human being, a human being with weaknesses like others. But every priest knows that something, a failure that in another person might be called an understandable failure, in a priest can too easily be called sickening hypocrisy, because he's a priest. And again, this is pushing him up onto that pedestal. There's that terrible insistence that priests and religious must be perfect. And if they can't be perfect, they must at least appear to be perfect. And that's a very dangerous way to attempt to live your life. There's also that, well, very naive idea that priests and religious are celibate. Therefore, they don't really have the same sexual feelings and desires as the rest of us. Well, they do. The second factor under this heading of power that I want to mention is that of papal authority. And this will apply in a very particular way to the response to abuse. Now, we know that the doctrine of infallibility states that the Pope cannot be wrong on a matter solemnly defined, the technical phrase, ex cathedra. But gradually, over centuries, the protection of that ex cathedra level of papal authority has meant that other levels also had to be protected. For example, the encyclical Humanae Vitae on contraception does not use the formal language of infallibility. And yet, so much papal energy has been invested in this teaching over so long a time that to say now that all those popes were wrong would be seen as striking a blow at all papal authority. Indeed, one may say that the widespread rejection of that encyclical over the last 40 years has already had that effect, as so many people have said to themselves, I am convinced that the Pope is wrong on this issue, so how do I know he's right on any other issues? And that phenomenon has led, undoubtedly, to a lessening of respect for all papal authority. In the same way, most popes have rejected the very idea of women priests, and to accept it now could be seen as admitting that 2,000 years of popes have all been wrong. And so, when pressure arose to discuss the matter, what happened? It was taken up to another level where the word infallible was introduced. And so there could be a prohibition even of discussion of the issue. Is church teaching condemning homosexual acts infallible? No. But it would be defended as though it were, because once again, so much papal energy has been invested in it. What about all church teaching on sexual morality? Well, there may be room to move on this or that point, but not on the core teaching, because once again, so much papal energy has been invested in it. What I'm suggesting is that it's not whether the formal language and the phrases like infallible and ex cathedra are used. The real criterion is the amount of papal energy that has been invested in a particular teaching, and so you have this phenomenon that is popularly called creeping infallibility, where infallibility creeps downwards. Indeed, to move a step lower, the law of priestly celibacy is no more than a law. Everyone admits that. And yet to change it now could imply that 1,000 years of popes have all been wrong. Yet again, so much papal energy has been invested in that law that to change it now could be seen as a blow against all papal authority. So even though it's only a law, and even though, as we all know, there are married priests within the Catholic Church, in the Eastern rites or among, say, convert clergymen from other churches, but even though it's only a law, so much papal energy has been invested, and indeed such harsh measures were taken at various times to enforce it, that once again, to change it could be seen as a blow against all papal authority. Remember, popes live in the Vatican. All those past popes are there around them, in their study, in the bedroom, in the corridors. You know, it would be an extraordinary thing for a pope to say, all you lot were wrong, and I'm right. Yeah, that would be a massive thing. Now, as a result of this, we have seen protectors of papal authority conclude that since all those popes cannot have been wrong, and since, therefore, obligatory celibacy cannot have been a contributing cause to sexual abuse, therefore they had to find another cause, and indeed another scapegoat. And as you would be aware, they did. The other scapegoat they found was priests whose sexual orientation is homosexual. And so they passed laws forbidding them from seminaries, etc. Now, this is not merely mistaken, because it's simply not true that homosexuality is a cause of pedophilia. But it's more than that, it's an avoidance of the truth in order to protect papal authority. And what I've said about papal authority obviously comes down to episcopal authority as well. But there's another factor that must be considered, even though in this case it's nothing more than a cultural factor. One does not have to be long in Italy before hearing the two terms bella figura and brutta figura. Now, literally they mean a beautiful figure and an ugly figure. But the better translation into English is keeping up appearances. Appearances matter. Appearances are important. Now, this idea was already powerful 2,000 years ago in the Roman Empire. And so it runs exceedingly deep in Italian culture. There is, of course, some truth in it. We all need appearances. We all present appearances. I'm doing it right now. We all do it. And yet, it's obvious that the idea is wide open to abuse because it involves an instinctive tendency to hide and deny anything that does not create bella figura. And when it is added to the need to protect all papal authority at all levels, it becomes a most dangerous idea. And once again, the bishops can get into protecting papal bella figura, and they can get into protecting their own bella figura. Before they are ordained, all bishops are required to take a special oath of fidelity to the Pope. Not to God, not to the Church, to the Pope. And this oath is a symptom of the constant and severe pressure on all bishops to protect all levels of papal authority and even the bella figura of the Pope at all costs and in all circumstances. A very high value is put on a bishop being a Pope's man. And please believe me, bishops are kept on a very, very short leash indeed. It was this pressure to be a Pope's man that led me to a very personal conflict between my duty of loyalty to the Pope, which I assure you I always have and still do take very seriously, but my duty of loyalty to the Pope and my duty of loyalty to that portion of God's people that the Australian bishops had assigned to me, namely the victims of sexual abuse. It was the conflict between being a Pope's man and a victim's man. I would love to have been both, but I found myself in a real conflict. And that conflict eventually became a genuine crisis for me, when on the one hand, I was constantly meeting and talking with victims and hearing their stories. Because of that, I was dealing, for the first time in my life, with the sexual abuse that I too had suffered as a young person. And on the other hand, the Pope of those years was giving no leadership, was not talking, not publicly, wasn't sending private messages to bishops either. Nothing was coming out. And he did absolutely nothing about the two cases that were on his desk and no one else could look at. The one of the Cardinal Archbishop at the time of Vienna, Cardinal Groer, and the founder of the Legionaries of Christ, Maciel Degolado. He did nothing with either of those cases. To the day of his death, he didn't. And nothing was being said. Now, we are a church that is centered around the Pope. Imagine this. Imagine that 20 years ago, 1988, Pope John Paul II, one Sunday morning in St. Peter's Basilica with the crowd in front of him, had said, "I've just been informed of these terrible abuses. Imagine, priests sexually abusing children. I've never heard anything worse. Let's respond as Jesus would have. Let's reach out with humility, with honesty, with compassion. Let's put victims before the good name of the church. Let's get to the bottom of this and find out the deepest causes, and let's eradicate them. I want everyone to do this. Above all, I want every bishop to do this." Imagine what an effect that would have had. In particular, the very loyalty of bishops to the Pope, which is so strong, would have worked in favor of victims instead of against them. That Pope, in a particular way, he was a great man, and I still admire him in so many matters, but he did nothing on this issue, and he constantly claimed authority. And with authority goes responsibility. You can't have one without the other. So I, like it or not, I have to see that failure as very, very powerful indeed in the whole response that the church made. Now, there's 1,000 years of history behind the system that I have just described, and it constitutes a powerful and deeply rooted culture. And to change a culture is one of the hardest tasks known to human beings. It's like taking a group of Americans and trying to change them into a group of Chinese. It's not just language, it's a billion different things, isn't it? Changing a culture. And yet, that's what we have to do. I hope that these few thoughts give some idea of why, in responding to abuse, it's essential to go well beyond the immediate causes of abuse and to look seriously at all the institutional factors, all the ways in which power is understood and exercised within the church. Sex. Always remember a big sign at home, great big one, with this one word on it in massive letters, sex. And underneath in tiny letters, "Now that we have your complete and undivided attention, would you please not drop your cigarette butts on the floor?" So now that I have your attention. In the First Testament, there are some quite beautiful things said about sex and sexuality. In particular, above all, in the Song of Songs. It's a beautiful poem to sexual love. And the interesting thing, if you read that, you'll see they're not married. They live in separate houses, this couple. And yet their love is obviously a sexual love. And this is in the Bible, this sexual love between an unmarried couple, and a beautiful poem concerning it. There are also in other places some quite beautiful statements made about sexuality and of course about love. However, having said that, those beautiful phrases are overwhelmed by two other ethics that you find in the First Testament. And they are the ethic of property and the ethic of purity. The ethic of property, first of all. In the ancient world, I do not just mean Israel, I mean the entire ancient world. It was not, society was not based on the individual. It was based on the family. And the family was centered around the man. And his wives, plural, his concubines, his children and his slaves were his property. And his wives and concubines were his sexual property. And this was one of the two ethics that dominated. You find, for example, in the book of Job, Job saying that he's always acted justly. And one of the examples he gives, he says, if ever I have transgressed with the wife of another man, then let some man have sex with my wife. And you think, just a minute, she hasn't offended. But look at it from the point of view of property law. In other words, if I've taken another man's property, let another man take my property. You know, this property ethic comes through again and again. Then along came Jesus, and he abolished it with one simple phrase, particularly in the Gospel of Mark, where he says, when a man commits adultery against his wife. Now that was revolutionary. Before that, only the woman could commit adultery, of course, if she had sex with any other man. But if the man had a sexual relationship with an unmarried woman, it was not adultery because it did not violate the rights of any man. He committed adultery only if he had sex with another man's wife. Then he violated the rights of that man. Along comes Jesus and talks about him, the man committing adultery against her. In other words, he's violated her rights. And that actually overthrew the entire system of the ancient world. Society as a whole had to find another basis. It could no longer be organized around families which were centered on the rights of the man. The wife had rights now under Jesus. And effectively, it meant that the church had to find a whole new basis for society. And it's one of the problems, it's still trying to do so. But yet Jesus was totally revolutionary on this point. And in that one phrase, did away with the whole property ethic. The purity ethic was the ethic of clean and unclean. I mean, it's ritual purity I'm talking about. Clean and unclean actions, clean and unclean foods, etc. And when a person was unclean, then, for example, they were not allowed to enter the temple until they had been cleansed. And a number of these laws affected foods. You're all aware of that. Pork, for example, was an unclean food. But it also affected various aspects of sexuality. For example, even a married couple, if they had sexual intercourse, they were unclean until they had been purified. A woman during her menstruation was unclean, and indeed, if she sat on a chair, the chair became unclean, so that if someone else then sat on it, they became unclean. All these kinds of laws governing a number of different aspects of sexuality came under this heading of the unclean. Now, Jesus abolished this principle too, when he said, nothing that enters the body from outside can make a person unclean. There are no unclean foods. And other places there are no unclean people either. He abolished the entire concept of purity. Now, the problem for the early church was that having abolished these two principles, Jesus did not spell out the details of what he would put in their place. And this is a most important fact. Jesus abolished the two principles which above all had dominated, but he did not spell out what he would put in their place. As a result of this, two things happened. Firstly, something of the two ethics of both property and purity remained in Christian history, and you find traces of them. Well, the property ethic still exists today, doesn't it? The idea after a divorce, she's my property, how dare she think of marrying someone else? And the purity ethic also exists. It was part of the reason for the first introduction of obligatory celibacy for priests. The idea that there was something unclean about a priest having sex with his wife and then going straight over and celebrating Mass. There was something unclean going on here. So the big division was made between the priest was not to have sex, he was to be celibate. That was the first effect of these two ethics somehow continuing. But the major one was that the substitute idea that the church found did not come from the Gospels. It did not come from anywhere in the Scriptures. It came from a Jewish philosopher who lived, Philo of Alexandria, who lived in the diaspora among non-Jews, and who was seeking to justify Jewish laws to pagans, particularly to those pagans who were interested in joining the Jewish religion. And he developed a system of what he called things that are natural and things that are unnatural to explain the Jewish laws. And this influenced various Christian thinkers of the time and was taken over by the church, right up to our own day, where it became the idea that every natural act of intercourse must contain two elements: a unitive element, the love and mutual support of the spouses, and a procreative element, an openness to new life. This is exactly the argument that you will find in the encyclical Humane Vitae. The two elements that must be there, so that to use the sexual faculties when either of these elements was not present, unitive or procreative, was considered unnatural, and importantly, was considered a direct sin against God, because it was going against a divine plan and indeed a divine order. Now, this too led to unhealthy consequences. It meant that even thinking about sex was a sin. And because it was a direct sin against God, every sexual sin was mortal. There were no venial sins in this field of sex. This made many people despair of leading a moral life and give up. It led to the real oddities, like people saying to themselves, well, if thinking about sex is a mortal sin and doing it is a mortal sin, I might as well do it. You think I joke? Most important of all, I believe, was that it encouraged the idea of an extraordinarily angry God who would consign a person to an eternity of punishment in hell for a single sexual thought. There are elements here so unhealthy that when put together with an unhealthy psychology and unhealthy living conditions, once again, they can lead to such things as sexual abuse. Let me take that idea just a little bit further to explain it to you. Two friends have a few drinks, get a bit drunk, a fight starts, they punch each other. Not good, but they'll probably get over it the next day and their friendship will be restored. Now, imagine a person punching the Queen of England. Much more serious. Two reasons. Firstly, because she's a really nice elderly lady. Well, she is. But secondly, because she is the Queen of England. And so an offence against her is an offence against the entire nation. I mean, it would be the same if someone were to punch President Bush. Now all you Democrats keep quiet. Control yourselves, please. Well, it would be serious. He's your president. And an offence against him is an offence against you. I mean, think to the terrible, the death of John Kennedy and the effect that was the nation was struck a terrifying blow. So it's this idea that's being applied here. God is far, far above the Queen of England and even, dare I say, the President of the United States. Well, to a foreigner he is anyway, so. So an offence against God has to be serious, right? It's not like punching your friend. This is like punching the Queen or the President. This is an offence against God. And that's one of the reasons why every sexual sin was considered mortal, because it was a direct sin against God. And so it was, if you like, put on the same level as blasphemy, because these were the two sins that were directly against God rather than against any other human being. And I suggest there's something very, very unhealthy here. Furthermore, in placing all the emphasis on the sin against God rather than the offence against the abused minor, these ideas were a direct part of the unsatisfactory response to abuse. An offence against a minor was treated overwhelmingly and often exclusively as a sexual sin against God. Remember the thinking, the sin against God way up there is mortal. The sin against another person, even this minor, that's lesser, isn't it, somehow, than this great sin against God. And so it was to be dealt with in exactly the same manner as any other sexual sin. And that meant confession, forgiveness, and restoration to where one had been before. You know, as in all those confessions where people go and confess to what, bad thoughts or something, and the whole belief, okay, they've confessed, they're forgiven, and they're restored. Well, that principle was applied here. They were restored, and if you didn't restore them, then somehow you weren't forgiving them. And this contributed, I'm not saying it's the sole cause, it contributed to that whole thing of transferring and offending priests from one place to another place. Indeed, to argue for a sterner response, even today, can still lead to the accusation of being lacking in the essential Christian virtue of forgiveness. And I've been accused of that by a cardinal in Rome, that I was lacking in forgiveness because I talked this language of not restoring a person. The problem is overcome only when, in forgiving a past wrong, we see the necessity to take all precautions to prevent a future wrong. And we will do this only when we place the emphasis not on a direct offence against God, but on an action deeply offensive to God because of the harm caused to an innocent child. In other words, that's what gets God upset. I do not believe that God gets upset by sexual desires and actions in and of themselves alone. If you quote me, please quote both halves of that sentence. I do not believe that God gets upset by sexual desires or actions in and of themselves alone. After all, God created sex. Why would God get upset by sex in and of itself? What gets God really upset is the harm caused to an innocent child. That makes God deeply angry. And so in relation to sex, I believe that the first question we need to be asking is not whether it harms some natural order or alleged natural order determined by God, but whether it is in any way harming either another person or the community or even oneself. I also suggest that not harming others is not enough. For if Jesus did not spell out the details of what he would put in place of what he'd abolished, he did give the overriding principle when he said, love one another. And loving my neighbour is a lot more than merely not harming my neighbour. Also, if you follow that not harming principle, you're inviting brinkmanship. I can go right up to the very brink of harming and in order to please myself. But if you do that, then a society as a whole is going to cross that brink time and time and time again. So this principle emphatically does not mean that if you feel even a transient liking towards someone, you can do what you like. At the very least, it means putting the other person first, as all true loving must do. For the rest, can I invite you to read chapter 10 of the book, where I've tried to spell out carefully exactly what I do mean and what I don't mean. And if you're going to quote me, please at least read that before you do so. Now, because I've written this book, people are constantly saying to me, well, this is all very well, but how do we bring about the kind of changes that you speak of? Well, a few principles, but the very first one of them is that change is going to be difficult because we're trying to change a culture, and cultures are not easy to change. I don't have some neat program that's going to do this, and if anyone came here thinking that they would hear such a thing, I deeply regret you're going to go away disappointed. I have no magic means of doing this. Having said that, there is then the relationship with the bishops. Now, this is much more complex. There are times when you have to confront. I openly acknowledge that. There's no other way. There are some things. I come from another country, and it's very different, and every place I've been and everyone I've talked to has shown me that the whole phenomenon of sexual abuse and how it's handled is very different in your country from my own experience. Now, that automatically means I'm in no position to tell you what you have to do. I've seen things on which confrontation is necessary in this country. I profoundly believe you have to work to abolish the statute of limitations. Well, I've already told you, and it's in the book, I was a victim of sexual abuse myself, not a priest, not anyone in the church, but still sexual abuse. It took me more than 50 years to bring that down out of the attic of my mind and look at it and acknowledge it, and for the first time in my life to call it sexual abuse. It took me 50 years. So a statute of limitations that you must do within a year or two, it's giving such powerful messages to victims. We don't want to hear your story. That really it must be changed. There are other things too that really need to be changed, and there are people who need to be held accountable. And if leaders of religious orders or bishops have performed criminal actions, then they need to be just as responsible for the community as any other human being. They would find no excuses for me, nor any mitigation. So yes, there are times where confrontation is absolutely essential. Having said that, though, I would hate to see a whole community limit itself to confrontation. There will come a time when you also need conversation. And one of the major reasons is that the changes I seek in the church, these profound changes in relation to power and sex, many of them cannot at present come from any other source than the Pope. He alone can change many of the things I've spoken of this evening. If the law of celibacy is to change, that's where it has to be done. If a number of other things, that's where it has to be done. And we must be aware in those matters of the relative powerlessness of the bishops before the power of the papacy and of the Vatican systems that support that power. We must therefore, as far as possible, learn to work with the bishops rather than simply against them. This is where I'll candidly admit I've struck problems in coming from my culture to yours. But I believe this, so I say it. We must try to lead to that conversation. The title of my book is Confronting Power and Sex, but that's confronting issues, not necessarily persons. Mahatma Gandhi once said, "We must be the change we wish to see in the world." We must be the change we wish to see in the world. And the church I wish to see is a church of conversation. And so that's what we must be, or at least we must work towards. And if confrontation is necessary, then so be it. But somewhere, somehow, we must try to lead to conversation, where we can talk about things. This need for conversation, of course, is not solely with bishops. It's also with all the Catholic people. And you need to spend as much of your energy, at least as much, reaching out to other Catholic people as you do in trying to either confront or have a conversation with hierarchy in the church. To reach out to other people. The more people there are involved, the clearer their ideas are, the more agreement there is, the more chance we have of that conversation and that change taking place. And the final part of my answer to this is this question of what to do is that I believe that the best way to engage reluctant leaders in conversation is precisely through the issue of sexual abuse. For the scandal of abuse has been so great that it is arguably the one subject that still has the energy to do something as powerful as change a culture. All church leaders have, at the very least, been through a profound humiliation and embarrassment over this issue. All of them know, whether they'll admit it, but they know that the Pope did not give the leadership they would have hoped for. Despite the welcome statements made recently in the United States by Pope Benedict, we believe that there is still a need for a public apology directly to victims made by the Pope in St. Peter's Basilica surrounded by the cardinals, assuring victims that they were not guilty of any fault because they were victims of more powerful people who abused the power that the Church had given them. In that apology, the Pope should apologize for any ways in which teaching, structures, or attitudes within the Church may have contributed, and he should assure the victims that the Church will investigate all aspects of the matter in order to ensure that others are not abused as they were. We are by no means satisfied, however, that the Church is in fact doing everything possible to uncover the causes of abuse and to eradicate them. We believe that as a first step, there is a need to study all ways in which Church teachings, attitudes, laws, and practices contribute to unhealthy psychology, unhealthy ideas, and unhealthy living conditions. We know that celibacy is not the sole cause of abuse, but we also know that it is impossible to say that it has made no contribution. We wish to see a particular study of this matter, especially of the way in which an unwanted, unaccepted, and unassimilated celibacy can contribute to unhealthy psychology, for example, severe depression, unhealthy ideas, for example, misogyny, and unhealthy living conditions, for example, loneliness and lack of support. Looking beyond these immediate issues, we believe that no study will be adequate unless it looks at all matters relating to power and sex within the church. For example, the idea of priests and religious being taken up, the need to protect the good name of the church at all costs, the inability to look at issues surrounding abuse in a fresh light because of the fear that any questions asked might harm papal authority, the idea that abuse is primarily a direct sexual offense against God rather than offensive to God because of the harm caused to innocent children, and the need to distinguish between forgiveness of past wrong and prevention of future wrong. We have all been most unhappy with the overall response to abuse by church authorities at every level, and we ask for an investigation of why this was so. In particular, we ask for a study of any and all institutional factors that may have contributed to the inadequacy of the response and to such practices as the moving of offending priests from one parish to another. We believe that part of the problem was that each diocese and each religious order responded separately, so that the overall response of the whole country was most uneven, and the whole country inevitably ended up being judged by its worst cases. We believe that the means must exist whereby the whole country can respond as one in time of crisis. That one perhaps needs a little explanation. In the Catholic Church, there is the Pope in charge of the whole church, there is the Bishop in charge of his diocese, and there is nothing in between. The Bishops' Conference is a gentleman's club. To act as one here, it needed the unanimous consent of every bishop and, by the way, every religious leader. We came very close to this in my far smaller country. Even there, it required the unanimous consent of approximately 180 people, 30 bishops and 150 religious leaders. And we got 178. 2 held out, 1 bishop and 1 religious leader. We came that close, and it was a great pity we didn't get the 2. Your far bigger country, it was far, far more difficult, and it didn't happen. And that's, as a result, the country was unable to act as one. Well, I'm suggesting that's essential, not just in relation to sexual abuse. There are other issues where the church in this country needs to speak with one voice and not with a multitude of voices. To continue, one single good and holy man, Pope John Paul II, was unable, for whatever reasons, to respond adequately to this crisis, and the whole church suffered as a result. We believe that the ideas of collegiality and the sensus fidei of all Catholics, both proclaimed by the Second Vatican Council, must, as a matter of urgency, be given concrete form in specific structures that, had they existed, would have enabled a coordinated and far better response to abuse by the whole church. But at the moment, those 2 ideas were both proclaimed by the Second Vatican Council, but they have not been given any real structure, so they don't exist in practice. They exist in the textbooks of theology, but not in hard reality. Had they done so, then the response of the whole church had to have been far better. We know that there are very large numbers of sincere and devout Catholics who have serious problems with many church teachings concerning power and sex. We feel that these Catholics are so many and so sincere that they deserve honest conversation on these topics, rather than simply the imposition of authority or condemnation. An early title I thought of giving to the book was Nothing So Ugly, Nothing So Beautiful. Now this comes from a letter of John Henry Newman, written about a year or two before he made the step and joined the Catholic Church. And he wrote, "There is nothing on this earth so ugly as the Catholic Church, and nothing so beautiful." In the midst of the revelations of sexual abuse and of many of the grubbier details of the response, the Church was so ugly that outsiders turned away in disgust, while insiders like ourselves felt a deep shame and confusion. At the same time, I know that I'm speaking largely to people who have not left the Church, and they have not left because they have seen and experienced the beauty of the Church, and they still love that beauty. If you cannot see the ugliness of the Church, you're closing your eyes. But if you cannot see the beauty, you don't know the Church. If I have personally encountered some of the ugliest things in the Church in the story of abuse, I've also been in a privileged position to see some of the most beautiful, not least in all those people willing to get down into the dirt and the mud and the filth in order to help other people. Despite some of the reactions there have been to my book, it is emphatically not an attack on the Church or a desire to cause it harm. On the contrary, it comes out of an intense desire to see a better Church, a Church in which everything that is humanly possible has been done to eradicate all forms of abuse, a Church that encourages growth through freedom, a Church in which there is conversation rather than confrontation, a Church in which all, women as much as men, laity as much as clergy, share equally in the full life of the Church and can grow to become all they're capable of being by reclaiming the spirit of Jesus. I want to see a new Church for a new millennium.